before our review lab, and hopefully today's lecture will be relatively short, so you don't have a huge amount of new material in our last lecture. But we're going to talk about something that will pretty much only get touched on a few times throughout this class, but it is very important, which is the lymphatic system. So today we're going to be looking at lymphatics of pretty much everything except head and neck, and then when we get into our head and neck module, we'll have a separate lecture for head and neck lymphatics, because that'll obviously be a lot more important for you as dentists for learning lymphatic drainage of the head. Okay, so we'll start by outlining what the function of the lymphatic system is. Why do we have one? Then we'll look at the different lymphatic structures, some of which are visible in dissection, a lot of which are not, which is why we don't talk about this a lot in a gross anatomy lab, because a lot of these structures are not gross anatomy, they're too small. And then we'll look at lymphatic drainage patterns, both deep and superficial. And don't get too caught up in these lymphatic drainage patterns. We're not going to ask you complex drainage pattern questions. But basically, you'll want to know which regions of the body are drained by the largest vessels of the lymphatic system. And then for the superficial drainage, you'll want to know pretty much which of the deeper large vessels do the superficial pathways intersect with. Alright, so function of the lymphatic system. So our vascular system, our arteries and veins are connected by capillary beds, and within these capillary beds we have a net movement of water and plasma proteins out of the blood and into this area between cells called the interstitial space. We have this movement of fluid out, and we need something to happen with that fluid. Some of it will go back into the bloodstream, but not all of it, so we need some way to get rid of that. And this is where the lymphatic system comes in. So within these capillary beds, we'll have lymphatic capillaries, which are these green ones, intermingled throughout. These start as blind sacs, but they are totally permeable, so they can pick up anything that's washing around in this interstitial space and carry it away. So the blood vessels themselves are semi-permeable, so some of the materials in this area can't be carried away by the bloodstream, so we need some other system in order to flush out those bits. The fluid we find in the lymphatic system is called lymph, and lymph is chemically really similar to blood plasma. It's also going to carry white blood cells, and in certain regions it will also carry along fats that we'll talk about more when we get to the abdominal portion. And one of its main functions is to remove items from circulation. So your cells are constantly turning over within your body, and as those cells are replaced, they don't just magically disappear. So we need some system for carrying away cellular debris, as well as infectious agents need to be removed from different regions of the body. And the grayed out ones we'll talk about in a minute. All right, so why do we need to get rid of this interstitial fluid? The main reason is the amount of fluid coming out of the blood vessels is not equivalent to the amount of fluid that is being resorbed back into them. And the offset can be as high as 3 liters a day. So if we're pulling fluid out of the blood and not putting it back in, we're going to end up with dehydration problems as well as swelling problems in these areas where fluid is collecting. We also end up with some toxic materials in here that we don't want to flush directly back into the bloodstream. We want to filter it out later, which is another main function of the lymphatic system. And if we don't ever get rid of all that cellular debris and stuff that's out here, eventually we can change concentration levels in the interstitial fluid, so that will shift the osmotic gradient. So we're not going to be pulling fluid back in at all, and we're just going to be getting this net movement of water out of the blood vessels and into the interstitial spaces. Right, and our last things that it does, so the lymphatic system is primarily, or not primarily, one of its primary things it does is absorption and transport of dietary fats. So this is linked with the digestive system in some ways. And it's crucially important in immunological defense. So large portions of your immune system are related to the lymphatic system. So one of the main types of white blood cells are lymphocytes, which are manufactured in parts of the lymphatic system and transported throughout others. Yeah?
I sound dumb, but I'm saying maybe they don't know the grace like stuff or something. Like we have to know the gray, I'm sure, but the gray thing is like not as important as it's black. Why is it gray?
Oh, no, these are just, notice the things that are grayed out on this slide are the things that were in black 2 slides ago.
Okay.
It's just that these 2 slides, so you can't just ignore everything I just said because it's alternating. That would have been convenient. All right. So lymphatics are also going to be important for detecting cancer as well as predicting where cancers will spread in the body. So when we have a cancerous tumor that becomes metastatic, those cancer cells that are leaving it can be transported through the lymph system. So remember, those lymphatic capillaries are permeable. They're even permeable to entire cells. So cancer cells can pass into there. They'll get flushed along through the lymphatic system until they get to lymph nodes, which tend to filter things out. And when the cancer cells get into the lymph nodes, that can be a new residential site for cancers. So a lot of times this will be the first place where cancer is detected. If you find cancer in a lymph node, you can then look upstream of the lymphatic drainage to find where that cancer came from. Similarly, if you find a metastatic tumor, you want to look at the lymph nodes that are downstream of it to check to make sure that those haven't become resident sites for cancer cells as well. All right, so the lymphatic structures, we've seen quite a few lymphatic structures in class so far in lab, even if you didn't realize that they were lymphatic structures. So a number of these are dissectable. Bone marrow, I guess you probably haven't really seen yet in dissection. We're not going to dissect that out. Lymphatic nodules, sometimes these are dissectable structures, sometimes they're not. The ones that are not dissectable that we've come across are, we talked about the difference between the ileum and jejunum, that the ileum had more lymphoid nodules in it than the jejunum, but those weren't large structures that we could dissect out. But in some places, like the tonsils, these will be. There are organs that are lymphatic, and then we have lymphatic trunks, which are some of the larger vessels, and lymphatic ducts, which are the largest of the lymph vessels. So in here, these are lymph nodes. You guys probably saw some lymph nodes at some point during the dissections, especially in the thorax. And then there are a lot of structures that are way too small to ever see. So these lymphatic capillaries and vessels are going to be too small to dissect, as well as certain plexuses. All right, so bone marrow is a lymphatic tissue. So there's 2 different types of bone marrow. There's red and yellow, and the red is what's involved in the lymphatic system. So the red is hematopoietic. So this is going to be a site of manufacture of blood cells, including lymphocytes. The yellow part of the bone marrow is just fat, so don't worry about that. Our lymphatic nodules are clusters of lymphatic tissue that are not contained within a capsule. And this is what will differentiate them from the lymphatic organ. So we have these clusters of lymphatic tissues. They contain lymphocytes and macrophages. They're usually found in areas where we'll have introduction of antigens into the body. So areas where they group together are the tonsils. We'll see the tonsils when we do the dissection of the head. But they're present, again, pretty much anywhere where we have an entryway into the body. So throughout the gut tube, the respiratory tubes, and genital and urinary tracts. So these are sort of the first line of defense for any foreign bodies coming into the body. Okay, and our organs are going to be differentiated from the nodules in that they have a capsule as well as internal structure, so a cortex and a medulla, similar to what we saw in the kidneys. Our 3 organs that we're going to talk about are lymph nodes, the spleen, and the thymus. And we have seen all of these at some point in dissection. We'll go over a little bit about what their function is within the lymphatic system. Okay, lymph nodes are located everywhere in the body, and their function is to filter antigens from the lymph fluid. So they're going to be connected to the lymphatic vessels, and as the lymph is pushed through the lymph nodes, they're going to filter out antigens and things like that. These are going to be areas that will initiate immune response. So there's lymphocytes located within these lymph nodes that will respond to the presence of antigens. and generate antibodies. They can be found either individually in certain places. In certain regions of the body, there are big clusters, like in your armpit region, we have the axillary lymph nodes, which is a very high concentration of them. And this is a redundant system. So lymph that is passing through the lymphatic system doesn't pass through one single lymph node before it returns to the venous blood. It gets pushed through multiple lymph nodes on its way back to where it enters back into the venous system. Okay, our largest lymphatic organ is the spleen. So we mentioned the spleen when we were talking about the abdomen. The spleen is located in the upper left part of the abdomen, and in shape, it looks like a really oversized lymph node. The spleen has a number of functions. One is which to monitor the blood for foreign material. It's also an area that can initiate immune response, so we have lymphocyte proliferation within the spleen itself. It helps to break down the lymph, and then its other function, circulatory, is going to be storing and recycling blood components. So as things like red blood cells break down, the spleen will be in charge of getting rid of those damaged cells. And our last organ is the thymus that you guys probably saw when you did the mediastinum dissection. It's just sort of a sheet of fat in the superior mediastinum. And that's because it doesn't really do much in adults. But in children, this is a very active part of the lymphatic system. So this acts as a place to store blood components and is a primary producing region for T lymphocytes, as well as a site of maturation. After puberty, this thing pretty much degenerates into being mostly fat, but it may retain some ability to generate lymphocytes in adults. Right, so onto the vessels. Lymph vessels are similar to veins in that we start with the smallest ones and they get progressively larger as they drain into larger and larger vessels. So we start at capillaries, capillaries join together to form vessels, vessels join together to form trunks, and trunks join together to form ducts. Also similar to veins, lymphatic vessels contain valves within them to prevent backflow, so we want unidirectional flow within the lymph system. So here, these are our bicuspid valves, so they're opening when stuff is passing through them. If the lymph tries to wash back, it pushes the valves closed so that we can't move in the opposite direction. And the lymphatic system is a low pressure system. So this is not like the heart. We don't have anything generating pressure to push our lymph through. This acts by differences in pressure gradient, so particularly where it's going to drain into the venous system is going to be an area of very low pressure. And that low pressure is going to draw the lymph up through these vessels towards its area of drainage back into the venous system. So these tend to be very thin-walled because they don't have to resist any amount of pressure. And this is another one of the reasons why they're so hard to find in dissection. So if you think veins are hard to find because they're so floppy, lymphatics are even thinner walled than that. Right, so the structure of the drainage is we start out in these capillaries, which sit within the circulatory capillary beds. Capillaries drain into vessels. Vessels combine to form trunks. And our trunks all combine to form ducts. So here's our picture of our capillaries again. So the capillaries are going to sit in between the arterial and venous capillaries here and pick up that interstitial fluid and whatever is floating around in it to get it out of the area. We can find lymphatic capillaries pretty much anywhere that you find blood capillaries. There are a few particular regions where the lymphatic system does not deal with. One of these are teeth, also bone and bone marrow, as well as the entire central nervous system has its own sort of flushing system. So there's a special type of lymphatic capillary that we find in the digestive system, so particularly along the small intestine. And this is what's called a lacteal. So within the small intestine, there are these little finger-like projections called villi. And running up through the center of each one of these, we have a lacteal. So a single one of these lymphatic capillaries. And what it's doing here is it's picking up dietary lipids or dietary fats, as well as any of the vitamins that are lipid soluble. So that's going to make the lymph that flows through these vessels compositionally different from the lymph everywhere else in the body. So this is going to be normal lymphatic fluid plus this fat-filled stuff called chyle. Yeah?
Are you saying that this is in the intestines, or it has to first cross through the epithelial lining of the intestine to this?
Yeah, it has to pass through the epithelial lining, right? So this is inside of this. Same way we have our capillaries and our arteries and our veins. Right, so it doesn't like project out into the intestine uncovered. Right, and this chyle is going to be conveyed through ultimately the thoracic duct to get back into the venous system. So this is how we're getting all of those dietary lipids and lipid-soluble vitamins actually into our circulation. So they're not going directly into the blood supply here. They're not going to get into the blood supply until we get the lymph system draining back in. Right, so our vessels are when we have a bunch of capillaries draining together. So these are the next size up. These are the ones that have valves. We don't have valves within the capillaries themselves. And these are also what the lymph nodes are connected to. So the lymph flows through the vessels, gets pushed through the lymph nodes to be filtered, and then passes up through a larger vessel to more and more lymph nodes. The deep drainage of the lymphatic system tends to follow the vasculature, and the names for the lymphatic vessels are going to be named for whatever the largest parts of the circulatory system in that region are. But that's going to be different than the superficial ones that we'll see don't follow venous drainage. Okay, so as our vessels continue to join up, eventually we form a larger structure called a trunk. And there are 4 pairs of these trunks plus 1 unilateral trunk or 1 unpaired trunk. So there'll be 9 altogether.